The familiar rumble of the engine vibrates through the seat, a comforting massage I've known for decades. It's a sound that tells me we're going somewhere, a reliable promise kept countless times. This old Chevy, she's more than just a truck. She's a companion, a witness to a life lived. Each creak and groan has a story, a memory etched into the metal and worn upholstery. Today, it's a run to Miller's Hardware, just on the edge of town. Need a few bits and pieces for Mrs. Henderson's porch railing. The wood's starting to give way, and she's been having trouble with her walker. Can't have that. The sun catches the dust motes dancing in the cab, illuminated by the morning light filtering through the slightly grimy windshield. I make a mental note to give her a good wash later, though I say that to myself every few weeks. She earns her dirt, that's for sure. Turning onto Main Street, I nod to old Mr. Abernathy watering his petunias. He's been there as long as I can remember, a fixture like the old oak tree down by the creek. Small towns, you know. Everyone's got their place, their rhythm. Mine usually involves this truck and whatever needs fixing. The radio's playing some old country tune, something about lost love and dusty roads. Seems fitting. I tap my fingers lightly on the steering wheel, keeping time with the music. It's a simple pleasure, these quiet moments on the road. No need to rush, no deadlines breathing down my neck, just the open road and the steady beat of the engine. Pulling into the hardware store parking lot, I find a spot near the back, away from the newer, shinier vehicles. They always look a little out of place next to Bessie, that's what I call her. Short for Chevrolet, but she's earned the affectionate nickname. Shutting off the ignition, the sudden silence feels almost strange for a moment. I take a breath, the familiar scent of oil and old metal filling my nostrils. It's a comforting smell, the smell of work and reliability. Inside Miller's, the air is thick with the scent of sawdust and paint thinner. I exchange a few words with young Tim behind the counter, a good lad, always helpful. I gather the screws, brackets, and wood stain I need, the weight of the bag familiar in my hand. On the way out, I see Martha waving from across the aisle. We chat for a few minutes about the upcoming town picnic and her prize-winning apple pie. It's these small connections, these everyday interactions, that make up the fabric of life here. Back in Bessie, the bag of supplies sits on the passenger seat like a silent promise. I start the engine, the familiar rumble returning, and pull back onto the road. Mrs. Henderson's place is just a few blocks over. I'm already picturing how I'll reinforce that railing, making it sturdy and safe for her. It's a small thing, really, but it matters. Helping out where I can, that's always been my way. This old truck has hauled more than just lumber and tools over the years. It's carried the weight of small favors and quiet acts of service, and that, more than anything, is what she's truly built for. The sun is higher now, casting long shadows as I head towards Mrs. Henderson's. The familiar rhythm of the road a constant companion. The red and blue lights in the rearview mirror weren't part of my usual morning commute. My foot instinctively eased off the accelerator, a knot of mild confusion tightening in my chest. Had I missed a sign? Was I going too slow? I glanced at the speedometer, steady as she goes. Still, those flashing lights demand attention. I signaled, the old indicator blinking its familiar, slightly off-kilter rhythm, and pulled over to the side of the quiet road. Dust billowed slightly from the shoulder as Bessie came to a stop. I turned off the engine, the sudden silence amplifying the distant chirping of birds. My hands rested on the steering wheel, still and steady. Decades of driving have ingrained that habit, hands at 10 and 2 even when stopped. I watched in the rearview mirror as two young officers approached. One was tapping something against his leg, the other's hand rested on his hip. They looked eager, maybe a little bored until now. The first officer, the taller one, leaned down to my window. "License and registration, sir," he said, his tone polite but perfunctory, like he'd said it 100 times that morning. "Morning, officer," I replied, my voice calm. "Just heading over to a friend's place." I reached into my pocket for my wallet, the familiar worn leather comforting in my hand. I carefully extracted my driver's license and the truck's registration, handing them over. The second officer, the one who hadn't spoken yet, was circling Bessie, his gaze sweeping over her faded paint and various dents. I could almost hear the unspoken judgment in his eyes. "Nice truck," he said, a hint of sarcasm lacing his voice. I didn't reply, just kept my gaze forward, waiting. No need to get defensive. She's served me well, this old girl. The taller officer took the documents, his eyes scanning them quickly. Address checks out. Registrations, well, it's seen better days. He chuckled softly to his partner, who smirked in response. Still valid, though, I said quietly. He glanced back at the registration, then at me. Since '68, huh? You've had this thing longer than I've been alive. There was a note of disbelief in his voice. He stepped back, conferring briefly with his partner, their voices too low for me to make out. The second officer was now running his hand along the rusted fender, a look of mild distaste on his face. I could feel their assumptions building, their quick judgments based on the weathered exterior of my truck and my age. It's a common enough thing, I suppose. People see the outside and think they know the inside. They don't see the stories etched into the metal, the miles traveled, the work done. They just see an old man in an old truck. The taller officer returned to the window. Everything seems to be in order, sir. Just a heads up, you might want to look into getting those plates updated. They're pretty faded. He handed back my license and registration. Have a good day. Relief washed over me, a quiet sigh escaping my lips. Just a routine stop, then. Nothing to worry about. I was about to put the truck in gear when the second officer spoke up, his tone a little sharper this time. Hold on a second, partner. Something doesn't feel right about this. The knot in my chest tightened again. This wasn't over after all. The words hung in the air, a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The taller officer paused, his hand still resting on the doorframe. I kept my gaze steady, meeting the eyes of the second officer. There was a suspicion there, a doubt that hadn't been present moments before. "What's the problem, officer?" I asked, my voice even, betraying none of the unease that was starting to simmer within me. He leaned in closer, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked past me into the cab. "You got any ID on you besides the license?" he asked, his tone less polite now, a hint of challenge creeping in. I reached back into my wallet, carefully extracting another card, a retired military ID. It was worn, the edges softened with age, but the picture was still clear. I handed it over. He took it, his eyes flicking between the photo and my face. His partner peered over his shoulder. A slight scoff escaped the second officer's lips. "Retired? Yeah, sure, old-timer. What were you, a cook?" The casual disrespect stung a little, but I didn't react outwardly. Let him think what he wants. My service speaks for itself to those who know. "Just sit tight for a minute, sir," the taller officer said, his tone now carrying a hint of the other officer's suspicion. They both stepped back from the truck, conferring again, their voices low and conspiratorial. I watched them in my side mirror, their heads close together, their eyes occasionally flicking back towards my truck. What was it about an old man and an old truck that had them so worked up? The second officer gestured towards the back of my pickup, where the lumber and hardware supplies for Mrs. Henderson were neatly stacked. "What's in the back there?" he called out, his voice louder this time, tinged with an accusatory edge. "Just some materials for a neighbor," I replied calmly. "Fixing her porch railing." He smirked. "Sure you are. What do you think, partner? Probably hauling moonshine in this thing." His partner chuckled, a short, dismissive sound. The unfairness of their assumptions started to prick at my patience, but I kept it in check. No good would come of arguing with them. They began to circle Bessie again, this time running their fingers along the dents and the rust spots. To them, it was just a dilapidated old vehicle. They couldn't see the stories held within those imperfections. The scrape on the front fender from that deer on Highway 17, the dent in the side from that tight squeeze in the hardware store loading dock years ago, each mark a memory, a testament to years of faithful service. "Step over here, sir," the second officer said, the word sir dripping with a mockery that wasn't there before. He gestured towards the side of the road. I complied, opening the door slowly and stepping out. My knees protested slightly, a familiar ache, but my movements were deliberate, measured. Years of experience had taught me that resistance often just made things worse. Besides, Mrs. Henderson could wait a few more minutes for her railing. This would play out as it would. The sun beat down on the asphalt, radiating heat through the soles of my worn boots. I stood where the officer had indicated, my hands clasped loosely in front of me, watching as they continued their examination of Bessie. The second officer was now peering into the truck bed, his expression skeptical as he eyed the neatly stacked lumber and bags of screws. "Wheelchair ramp materials, huh?" he said, not as a question, but as a statement of disbelief. His partner joined him at the back of the truck, running a hand over the fresh-cut wood. "Looks legit enough," he conceded, but there was still a lingering doubt in his voice. They weren't convinced. Not yet. I could feel their suspicion clinging to me like the heat radiating from the road. The second officer turned back to me. "Empty your pockets, old man," he instructed, his tone curt. I nodded slowly and began to do as he asked, laying the contents on the dusty shoulder of the road. My keys, jingling softly as they landed. My worn leather wallet, its creases holding the shape of countless cards and faded photographs. A small, well-thumbed notebook. And a folded photograph, its edges softened with time. The second officer's eyes landed on the notebook. He picked it up, flipping through the pages with a dismissive flick of his wrist. His brow furrowed slightly as he scanned the names and the markings within. Some names had stars beside them. Others were crossed out entirely. "What's this? Some kind of code?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion again. "Just names," I replied simply. "Men I served with." The word hung in the air, perhaps carrying a weight they didn't understand or didn't care to. He tossed the notebook back to me, landing a little too close to the edge of the asphalt. I reached down and picked it up carefully, brushing off the dust. Those weren't just names, they were faces, memories, shared experiences forged in places these young men could likely only imagine. Next, his attention fell on the folded photograph. He picked it up, unfolding it with a snap. It was a picture of a younger me, standing with a group of men in uniform, their faces grimy but smiling, the backdrop a dusty, unfamiliar landscape. "Who are these guys?" he asked, his gaze sharp. "My unit," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "A long time ago." He studied the photograph for a moment longer, his expression unreadable, before tossing it back with the same careless disregard as the notebook. It landed near my keys. I picked it up, carefully refolding it and tucking it back into my wallet. These weren't just trinkets. They were fragments of a life lived, sacrifices made. "Well," the taller officer said, stepping forward again, his attention back on Bessie. "Your truck's not exactly road legal, that's for sure. No plates, no current tags." He trailed off, shaking his head slightly. "We're going to have to run a full check on this vehicle, sir. And on you." The waiting began again, the sun continuing its relentless descent. I sat on the curb, the rough concrete pressing against my legs. The heat radiating from the road was starting to become uncomfortable, but I didn't shift or fidget. Years of, let's just say I'd endured worse discomfort in less hospitable places. The two officers were back at their patrol car, their voices low as they spoke into the radio. I could catch snippets of their conversation, something about possible stolen vehicle, elderly male, and uncooperative tone. Uncooperative? I'd answered every question they'd asked, complied with every request. My silence, I suppose, was being interpreted as resistance. People drove by, their gazes lingering for a moment before they moved on. Some even slowed down, their phones held up, recording the scene. It was a strange feeling, being on display like this, a curiosity for passers-by. I wondered what story they were constructing in their minds, what assumptions they were making about the old man sitting on the curb next to a beat-up truck. My hand instinctively went to my pocket, my fingers brushing against the folded letter inside. It was a simple retirement note, signed by a man whose name carried considerable weight. BM, it read at the bottom. Just initials, but they represented years of service acknowledged, a chapter closed with respect. In the glove compartment of Bessie, tucked safely away, was a framed certificate, the Bronze Star, and next to it, a faded photograph of a younger, leaner me standing with the men in that earlier picture, a unit I once commanded. These weren't things I carried around for show, but they were there, tangible reminders of a life lived in service. The younger of the two officers, the one who seemed particularly suspicious, leaned against the hood of their patrol car, sipping from a paper cup. His partner was still talking on the radio, his brow furrowed in concentration. 30 minutes had passed since they'd pulled me over. 30 minutes of sitting here, under the judging eyes of strangers, while these young men tried to find something amiss. The older officer finally ended his radio call. He walked back towards me, a clipboard in his hand. "Everything's coming back clear on the vehicle VIN, he said, his tone slightly less accusatory now, but still carrying a hint of doubt. No reports of it being stolen. That much was obvious. Bessie was mine, bought and paid for decade ago. "What about him?" the younger officer asked, gesturing towards me with his cup. The older officer shrugged. "License is valid, no outstanding warrants." There was a pause, a moment of uncertainty between them. They hadn't found what they seemed to be looking for. Then the younger officer kicked one of Bessie's tires, the sound echoing in the quiet afternoon air. "Bet this guy thinks he's Rambo," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for me to hear. A passing teenager, phone in hand, snickered, taking a selfie with me in the background. "Grandpa's in trouble," the caption probably read, uploaded to some social media platform without a second thought. The indignity of it all was starting to wear thin, but I remained outwardly impassive. Let them have their assumptions. The truth, as it often does, would eventually reveal itself. "Should we check his meds?" the younger officer joked, a smirk playing on his lips. "Maybe he's forgotten who he is." The casual dismissal, the implication that my age equated to incompetence or confusion, was a familiar sting. It was the kind of prejudice you learned to live with, the background hum of a world that often valued youth over experience. My silence wasn't confusion. It was the practiced patience of a man who had faced interrogations by experts far more skilled and far more intimidating than these two local officers. Across the street, near the old gas station, I saw Mike Henderson, the owner, step out. Mike was a good man, a veteran himself. We'd shared a few quiet conversations over the years at the VFW hall. He'd recognize me. He squinted in my direction, a look of concern on his face. He pulled out his phone, his gaze fixed on me. I wondered who he was calling. Probably just checking in, making sure everything was all right. 40 minutes had now ticked by. The officers seemed to be growing bored with their roadside detention. The older one was leaning against the patrol car, scrolling through his phone. The younger one had finished his coffee and was tossing the empty cup into the roadside trash can. Their initial suspicion seemed to be waning, replaced by a kind of impatient resignation. They hadn't found a stolen vehicle, no drugs, no outstanding warrants. Just an old man with an old truck and a clean record. "Let's just wrap this up," the senior officer finally said, sighing and stretching. "Write him up for expired registration, improper display of plates, and unsafe vehicle. That ought to cover it." He started scribbling on his clipboard. 3 tickets. That would be a hefty sum for a fixed income. Rules were rules, I supposed, even if the interpretation felt a little enthusiastic in this instance. They approached me, clipboards in hand, the bureaucratic instruments of their judgment. The younger officer still wore that faint smirk. The older one looked more neutral, just going through the motions. They were about to deliver their verdict, the official documentation of my supposed transgressions, when a sound cut through the quiet afternoon air. It was the unmistakable rumble of heavy tires on asphalt, a deeper, more purposeful sound than the usual traffic on this road. Heads turned. A black SUV rounded the corner, its tinted windows obscuring the occupants, government plates gleaming in the sunlight. It didn't ease into position. It arrived with a sense of authority, a silent statement. It rolled to a smooth stop directly behind the patrol car. Both officers straightened up, their casual postures vanishing. They exchanged quick, uncertain glances. "Federal?" the younger one whispered, his voice losing its earlier bravado. "Maybe FBI?" The air crackled with a sudden, unexpected tension. Neither of them guessed correctly. The back door of the SUV opened. A tall man in a full 4-star general's uniform stepped out of the black SUV. The midday heat seemed to ripple off the asphalt as I sat there, my shadow offering little relief. The officers, who had positioned themselves under the meager shade of a nearby tree, straightened up as if jolted by an electric current. Their earlier confidence had completely evaporated, replaced by a palpable nervousness. The general's gaze swept over the scene, taking in the patrol car, my old truck, and finally settling on me sitting on the curb. His expression was unreadable, a mask of professional authority. He didn't offer a greeting to the officers, didn't acknowledge their presence with a nod or a word. His attention was solely focused on them. "Which of you stopped this man?" His voice was firm, carrying a weight that had nothing to do with volume. It was the voice of command, one that expected and received immediate obedience. The air seemed to thicken, the sounds of passing traffic fading into a hushed silence. The 2 officers shifted their weight, their eyes darting between the general and me. The younger one, the one who had made the Rambo comment, stammered, Sir? We were just conducting a routine traffic stop, sir." His voice cracked slightly. The general's gaze remained fixed on them, unwavering. He raised a hand, a simple gesture that silenced the officer mid-sentence. "That man," he said, his voice low and deliberate, pointing directly at me. "That man is Harold Briggs." The name hung in the air, perhaps meaning nothing to these young officers, but carrying a profound significance that was yet to be revealed to them. He took a step closer, his eyes still locked on the officers. "Harold Briggs taught me how to lead." The words were delivered with a quiet intensity that underscored their importance. "Sir," he continued, his gaze unwavering, "at Fort Bragg, 1983, he ran recon and saved my entire squad in training when we lost signal in the swamp." As the general spoke, another figure emerged from the SUV. This man was also in uniform, his bearing equally sharp. He carried a leather portfolio embossed with what looked like the presidential seal. He stood at perfect attention beside the general, a silent testament to the gravity of the situation. Across the street, the small crowd of onlookers had grown, drawn by the unexpected arrival of military brass in their quiet town. Cell phones were held aloft, recording every moment. A retired mail carrier, a familiar face from my neighborhood, whispered something to his wife, his eyes wide with surprise. "That's why I always left extra stamps for Mr. Briggs," I heard him say, his voice hushed with a dawning understanding. One of the officers blinked, his earlier arrogance completely gone, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. We didn't know, sir. You didn't ask." The excuse sounded weak, even to my own ears. The general turned his attention fully to me, his expression softening slightly. Permission to help you up, Sergeant Major? I stood up without assistance, my knees protesting with a familiar creak, but my posture straight. Permission granted, General, I replied, my voice quiet but firm. The cameras recording the scene across the street remained silent, the onlookers seemingly holding their breath. The general turned back to the two young officers, his gaze hardening once more. You just disrespected a man with 3 combat tours and 40 years of service to this nation. His voice carried a weight of authority that brooked no argument. This truck, he gestured towards Bessie with a sweep of his hand, it's part of Army history. So is he. He then faced the small crowd that had gathered, his voice projecting clearly across the street. This is what happens when we stop teaching respect. There was a pause, a moment for his words to sink in. A young girl nearby whispered to her mother, "Is he famous?" Her mother replied softly, "No, honey, he's more than that. He's real." The younger of the two officers, the one who had joked about my medication, removed his sunglasses, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Sir," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, looking directly at me. "We're sorry, sir." Truly. I met his gaze, my expression neutral. "Don't apologize to me, son," I said, my voice calm but firm. "Apologize to the next old man you pull over before you assume he's nothing." The general's aide stepped forward, holding the leather portfolio. The general took a file from within and handed it to the senior officer. "This is Sergeant Major Briggs's service record," he said, his voice level. "The unclassified version anyway. I suggest you both read it before your shift ends today." The officer accepted the file with a chastened nod, his eyes wide as he glanced at the thick document. "As for the truck," General Phillips continued, turning back to Bessie, "it has historical vehicle status granted by the Department of Defense. The paperwork is filed with your department annually. Perhaps you should check your records more thoroughly next time." Finally, I spoke up again, my voice quiet, but carrying a certain weight of experience. "General," I said, looking at Phillips, "these officers were doing their job, as they understood it. The fault isn't entirely theirs." The general turned to me, a slight furrow in his brow. "Explain, Sergeant Major." "We've created a system," I said, my gaze drifting towards the patrol car, "where badges and uniforms matter more than the people wearing them, where protocols replace judgment. I saw the same mistake in Vietnam, young men following orders without context." The general nodded slowly, his eyes meeting mine. "Always the teacher, aren't you, Harold?" For the first time that day, a small, almost imperceptible smile touched my lips. "Until they put me in the ground, sir." That afternoon, the sheriff's department issued a terse public statement acknowledging the traffic stop and the subsequent intervention of a high-ranking military official. The incident quickly exploded beyond our small town. The local news ran the story that evening, the headline blaring, "Legendary veteran detained, General defends former mentor." By the next morning, it was national news. Officers regret pulling over this old truck became a viral sensation. The image of me sitting on the curb juxtaposed with the imposing figure of General Phillips circulating across the internet. The mayor, a well-meaning but often flustered man named Thompson, declared June 4th as Harold Briggs Day. Donations started pouring in from across the country, a tidal wave of support for a man who had always preferred to remain unseen. Within the first week, over $247,000 had been sent to various veterans organizations in my name. I made it clear from the start. Not a single penny was to come to me directly. That money, I insisted, would go towards something tangible, something that would make a real difference for veterans who needed it. The idea came quickly. Wheelchair ramps. So many of our returning heroes struggled with accessibility in their own homes. The Harold Briggs Initiative was established, dedicated to building these ramps, free of charge, for disabled veterans nationwide. The waiting list grew rapidly. soon exceeding 300 names of families needing help. A small bronze plaque was placed at the corner of Maple and Pine, right where I'd been stopped. It simply read, "Respect for service. You never know who you're stopping." It was a quiet reminder, a permanent marker of a day that had unexpectedly thrust me into the spotlight. Life, for me, didn't change dramatically. I kept driving Bessie, her rumble a familiar constant. I still went to the hardware store, still helped neighbors with repairs, but now, when people saw the old truck, they didn't look through it anymore. They stepped aside with a nod, a quiet acknowledgement, a flicker of respect in their eyes. Weeks later, the younger of the two officers, Brian Keller, showed up at my doorstep. He looked nervous, his uniform crisp, but his demeanor uncertain. I invited him in for coffee. He sat at my kitchen table, the silence stretching between us. "I'm sorry, sir," he finally said, his voice sincere. "Truly sorry. I had no idea." I poured him a cup of coffee, the steam rising between us. "You learn from it, son," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "Or someone else pays the price next time." Brian started volunteering at the local VFW hall on weekends. At first, the other veterans eyed him with suspicion, the cop who had disrespected one of their own. But my quiet acceptance of him gradually opened doors. He started listening to their stories, understanding the weight of their experiences. The sheriff implemented a new training program for all officers, recognition and respect for veterans in our community. I reluctantly agreed to speak at the first session. I stood before a room full of young officers, their faces attentive. I kept my message brief, just 11 words. Service doesn't end with the uniform, neither should the respect for it. 3 months later, General Phillips returned. This time there was no motorcade, no uniform, just a familiar black SUV pulling quietly into my driveway. He wore civilian clothes, a comfortable-looking jacket and jeans, and carried a bottle of good Kentucky bourbon. We sat on my porch as the evening deepened, the air thick with the scent of honeysuckle and the soft glow of fireflies dancing in the twilight. He poured us each a drink, the amber liquid catching the porch light. "You turned it around, Harold," he said, his voice low and thoughtful. "Like always." I shook my head slowly. "They turned it around themselves, General. All they needed was a mirror." Bessie still rattles down Main Street every morning, carrying lumber, tools, and occasionally a flag-draped coffin when a veteran passes with no family to bear them to rest. But now, police cruisers pull over when they see her coming, not to stop her, but to offer a slow, respectful salute. The change is subtle, but it's there. A quiet acknowledgement of the man and the history the old truck carries. At the police academy, every new recruit now reads a laminated card, a simple reminder of that day on Maple and Pine. It contains just 6 words, a lesson etched in the unexpected arrival of a 4-star general. You never know who you're stopping. Brian Keller, the younger officer, didn't just apologize and disappear. He became a regular at the VFW hall, his initial awkwardness giving way to genuine camaraderie. One evening, as we repaired a leaky roof together, I asked him why he really came back. "Because I realized I knew nothing about the people I swore to protect," he admitted, his voice quiet. 4 years on the force, and I never once visited this place. The sheriff's new training program took root. The focus shifted from strict adherence to protocol to the importance of understanding the human being behind the wheel, behind the door. Harold Briggs Day became an annual event, not a celebration of me, but a day dedicated to honoring all veterans in our community, the visible and the invisible. General Phillips and I sat on the porch until the bourbon was gone and the fireflies had faded into the night. We talked about old times, about the men we served with, about the quiet battles fought long after the shooting stopped. As he stood to leave, he clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture of respect and enduring friendship. "You still teaching, Harold?" he asked, a hint of a smile in his voice. I nodded slowly, watching his taillights disappear down the road. Every day, General, every single day. The old truck sat in the driveway, a silent sentinel, a reminder that true honor doesn't always wear a uniform, and that the greatest lessons are often learned in the most unexpected encounters. The rumble of her engine in the morning is no longer just the sound of an old truck. It's a quiet testament to a community that learned to see beyond the surface.